Good evening. I'm Superintendent Bill Webster, and I thank you all very much for being here. This budget information session tonight, I hope everyone leaves with any questions they have answered. And I want to thank school committee members here. We have Tina Hutchinson, we have Mark Kayer, we have Renee Kudamarsh, and we have Francis Gagnon. Thank you very much. So I'm going to share much of the same information that I've given to the school committee and to the city council, but I think it's helpful to build this base to better understand why our budget is what it is. Tonight's session is being videotaped, and it's going to go online, so that even though there aren't many people here tonight, we hope that many people will view it before the vote that's going to take place on Tuesday. And I'll talk a little more about that. Before I begin my presentation, though, I'd like to invite Cindy Gish up here. And I'm holding a microphone just for recording purposes, not for amplification. And I'd like to have Cindy just talk a little bit about what is in this budget for Geiger Elementary School. This is obviously just one of 8 schools in Lewiston, but I think it might give the public a sense of some of the things that are in this draft budget. So Cindy?
First of all, welcome to Geiger. I feel like I should just talk to you too. So for Geiger, I know that the extra positions that we would be getting and some of the positions that are in the budget for us are a second grade teacher, which was our top priority to bring our class sizes down in the primary grades. A STEM teacher, which will be fantastic because we can add that as a unified arts rather than guidance, and our guidance counselors can be doing what guidance counselors should be doing, which is really the behavior and social emotional interventions with students that need it throughout the day. Yeah, so STEM would be a science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So for 40 minutes each week, every classroom would get a STEM class, so they would be doing hands-on science activities. And one of the things that some parents and community members have really voiced is that we've kind of lost that sense of science in our schools right now because we've had so much focus on literacy and mathematics. So that will start bringing that back in, and that's something that kids are super excited about, is that hands-on science activities that they can do. So that will be offered to students every week. And I actually just did a tour with a family today that's going to be moving to the area that will be working at Bates, and they're both scientists, so they were super excited to hear that. One of the unique things about Lewiston, as we all know, is that it's a growing school district, that we keep getting students where other school districts are losing students, and Lewiston just keeps growing and growing and growing. And the needs of our students keep growing and growing and growing. So added people in the building is always a plus. We've been in the position where we're looking for interventions for kids that they need supports where one thing might not be working and we need something else. And sometimes we just don't have the bodies to be able to provide that. So we have used some online interventions and everything like that, but nothing replaces an actual person that's trained to do those interventions. So adding those will be fabulous. We do have an ELL teacher also that's in the budget. We do have a growing ELL population here at Geiger. We're not the highest, we don't have the highest percentage of ELL students, but we do have the highest amount of languages spoken in any school in Lewiston. I think it's about 14 languages here. So that's really great. And I think about watching those students grow. We had a 4th grader that came here last year as a newcomer, didn't speak any English, and if you spoke to him now, you would never know that. It's just amazing the growth that he's made in 1 year. It just blows your mind. So adding these positions to our school, I know is best, number one, for our kids, and secondly, for our teachers. So I know that it will be a great impact on our school, as it will in all of the other schools.
Thank you, Cindy. So now I'm going to walk through a budget presentation. I think there are 27 slides in total, and I want to thank Tina Hutchinson, who's going to man the controls. So we'll go to the next slide. Just a little overview of the budget review process. The budget was first released on March 5th, almost 2 months ago. Hard to believe. We had 8 budget review sessions during the month of March. A lot of questions that the board had, a lot of suggested revisions. And with those revisions, the school committee ultimately approved the budget on April 9th. And just earlier this week, the city council approved that budget. We have tonight's informational session. And then next Tuesday is the validation referendum. This only takes place at Longley Elementary School Gymnasium, the old multipurpose building, and polls open at 7 a.m. and close at 8 p.m. What I want to cover tonight is the school funding formula and what that means for Lewiston, along with a term called minimum required local share. And you're going to be hearing that a lot. I want to talk about what approvals are necessary in order to receive full state funding. And we'll highlight our budget, as well as maybe give you some tools to assess the appropriateness of the budget. Now, the school funding is in a program called Essential Programs and Services. You might sometimes hear the acronym EPS. This was adopted in 2005, so it's hard to believe that we've had this same program essentially for the last 13 years. When it was first developed, the concept was, what is the minimum that schools should spend in order to appropriately educate children? And when they looked at the model in total, lo and behold, the state didn't have enough money to fund its share. And consequently, the model was limited to 97%. And it's been that way until this year. And we're going to talk about what that means. Again, it represents the cost of necessary programs. And once we determine, once the state determines what a school should spend, it determines what the state will pay and what the locality will pay, in this case, Lewiston. So again, the model increased to 100% on July 1st, this coming July 1st, and that is a significant bearing on Lewiston, which I'll go further into. So looking here, you can see this is total funding for schools, whether it be as determined by the EPS model, regardless of whether the funding is from the state or from the local. The red shows the 100% of the model. The green shows at 97%. So you can see all along that there's been close to $100 million shortfall excuse me, between the 97% model and the 100%. And yet, finally, in FY19, which is the year that begins July 1, they're at 100%. So, in order to fund 100%, the state, the model, identified $100 million more that needed to be provided. And I've just highlighted some of the key things. The model going from 97% to 100% added $42 million in total. In addition, in the model, special ed costs are covered with a 2-year lag, essentially at 100%. This is a very much growing expense for Maine schools. There was another $30 million there. The state is very much encouraging pre-K programs. They allocated another $10 million there. They lowered the number of students per teachers in some of the programs, which added another $8 million. They actually reduced the money available for district administration, which saved the state $8 million. And then other factors, 18, for a total of $100 million. So a very significant change in the formula. So what does this mean? So here we have what locals contribute, and here we have what the states contribute. So again, the two numbers together would equal what was on that earlier slide. And you may recall, I think we started out at around 1.9 billion, and you can see it's roughly the total of those. So all along, locals have contributed over 50%, and then you can see the state percentage slowly going up. You may recall that some years ago, the state it was a citizens referendum, approved the concept that state of Maine would pay 55% of the cost of education, which would mean that it'd be more than the local share. You can see the state consistently was spending less. Until you can see this year that begins July 1st, how the state share shoots up because of additional funding and moving that model from 97% to 100%. At the same time, the local share also shooted up, not to the same extent, but nonetheless a significant increase. So now, let's look at Lewiston. Going back to FY11, the 100% model said Lewiston should spend $70 million in our schools. Instead, we're spending about $68 million. Or at least that's what the model said we should spend. And all of a sudden, there's this big jump because the model went from 97% to 100%. Now, what does that mean for Lewiston? That $2 million shortfall each year meant that there were perhaps 50 positions that the model said should be in Lewiston schools but weren't. Now with the model 100%, the model in the state is saying, Lewiston, you should be adding those positions to your schools. So we're at 100% model now. How much should come from the state and how much should come from the local jurisdiction, or in this case, Lewiston? Well, first, the state determines what it can afford, and then what remains is what the local needs to raise. The state also has a property tax valuation for every community in Maine, including Lewiston. And they're actually able to compute what the local should raise based on the state mill rate. Now, Lewiston's mill rate locally will be a little different because we do our own assessment here in Lewiston. We don't use the state valuation model. But it kind of gives you an idea that the state mill rate went up 3.9%. So what it suggests, other things being equal, the state is expecting local taxes to go up by a minimum of 3.9%. Now, in addition, the state's valuation of Lewiston went up 1.9%. And if we add those two numbers together, in effect, there's a 5.9% in the state's expectation of what Lewiston is going to raise in local property taxes in order to receive full state subsidy. Now, let's look at the tax rate for Lewiston. This is the school tax rate, not the city side. You have to add the city side to get your total tax commitment. Since FY14, it was at $9.39. Again, that's the tax per $1,000 of valuation. Under the proposed budget, it's $10.72. Quite a jump from here to here, about 5.3%. The tax rate did go down last year. You can see it went from 1030 to 1019. I'm getting over a cold and I didn't think to bring myself some water. But my assistant superintendent, Sean Shabbat, is coming through as usual. Thank you. Oh, that might be, I'm good right now, thank you. The school budget by state law is divided into a number of what are called articles. There's an article for special ed, there's an article for regular instruction. And the school committee approves those expenditures by article. Then the total expenditures and the revenues to support them are approved by both the school committee and city council. The city council doesn't allocate the budget, but they do set the total. And if they were to cut the total, the school committee would have to adjust the articles. So the city council did approve the budget in a 5-2 vote on Tuesday. What happens, however, if we were to cut the taxes from the minimum required local share? Right now, the state pays approximately 75% of taxes of the tax bill that supports Lewiston schools. In other words, for every dollar that we raise locally, we receive additional $3 from the state of Maine. If we raise less than the minimum required local share, for every dollar that we do not raise locally, Lewiston Public Schools will see reduced funding of the $3 from the state, which if you add to that dollar is a reduction of $4. So one of the challenges for a community like Lewiston that has only raised the minimum required local share is the impact of raising less than that. And you can see that if we were to want to reduce local taxes by $20,000, which is roughly a penny on the tax rate, the impact on a budget reduction is 4 times that, $80,000. A $200,000 reduction would require a budget reduction of $800,000. Most communities, not all, most communities in Maine already raise above the minimum required local share for their schools. They don't have this situation. But because Lewiston has always been at the minimum, when the state, in effect, is saying you've got to raise your taxes if you're going to get full state subsidy. Other communities don't have to deal with that. Auburn doesn't have to deal with that, for example. So let's take a look at some of the more specifics of the budget. So remember, it's at minimum required local share. One of the major reasons for increase is our new school, which will open a year from August. Even though the state is paying for the school, it still must show up in our expenses. And that represents about 37% of our expenses. And the other increases, which I'm going to go into a little more depth, relate directly to students, almost all of them. So here's, in summary, what the budget looks like. Local taxes, we raise about $20 million in support of schools in adult ed. That's up 6.3% from last year. You know, a significant increase. The state and other revenues are up 13%. So again, the state covers roughly 75% of our budget. And went up significantly, as you remember going back, when the state went up from 97 to 100% of the model, they greatly increased the revenue for local districts. Our expenses have gone up our total $82.9 million, a change of 11.7%. The tax rate at 1072 is a 5.3% increase. Again, much less than the expenditure increase because of the additional state funding. So here are just some statistics about Lewiston. Here is our enrollment trends over the last 10 years. And while our enrollment growth has slowed, we're still going up. And you can see that since 2008, we've added approximately 800 students in Lewiston. This next thing, though, I think is particularly telling. Going back to 2008, comparing our enrollment to what it was in 2008. So obviously in 2008, enrollment is 100% of what it is in 2008. In 2009, Lewiston had 4% growth, and you can carry it through to now. we're up about a little over 15% from what our enrollment was in '08. Whereas the rest of Maine drops the percent, dropped 2%, bring it through 2016, which is the last numbers I had available. Enrollment there is roughly 93% of what it was in '08. Very different picture in other parts of Maine. ELL stands for English Language Learners. You can see this percentage has continued to go up. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting more immigrants from outside of Lewiston. What it does mean, increasing percentages of children in our schools come from homes where English is not the primary or first language spoken. So right now, about 28% of students in Lewiston are English language learners. Special ed is also a growing thing, and you can see that a little over 50% of our students were receiving special ed services in 2011, and now that's about 18%. Special ed costs are expensive, but they are legally required. We must meet the conditions of what's called an IEP, the Individualized Educational Plan, that we have for every student. Also, we know that Lewiston attracts families with special needs. We have 2 hospitals, we're a service center, we've got the doctor's offices and other things to help support families that have children with special needs. And one of our challenges that we face in Lewiston is some of those special needs very specialized programs. If we can have those programs in-house as opposed to outside, they're much less costly. So let's take a look at this. This is just kind of interesting. It gives you an idea of how much this area has grown. So high-cost special ed populations. By high cost, we're talking $50,000 or more per year for a special ed student. In 13-14, we had 130 students that were in so-called special purpose private schools. Margaret Murphy would be an example of that school. Spurwink has a program. There are other schools across Maine, and some even outside of state. In 13-14, we had 36 students in an in-district day treatment program. By day treatment, it's a behavioral program, a self-contained behavioral program. We did not have what's called the RISE program, and I can't remember what RISE stands for, but it is a program for students with autism. Do you remember? What does RISE stand for? Right. Thank you. We've expanded that program each year, and one of the interesting things, so this year we now have 128, up from 36 just 4 years ago, which is great. The outer districts have gone from 130 to 106. So whereas, and I didn't put a total on here, we had 166 students between in-district and out-of-district. Now we've got 234. So just a tremendous growth in special ed and the costs associated with it. So what do we have in this budget? We have class reduction positions, and the Geiger principal made reference to the second grade teacher as an example of the types of positions in that number. We also increasing STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math in our schools, and one of those teachers is in Geiger. And then in talking about the special ed costs, you can see 36 of the 62 new positions are special ed. Now, the state of Maine reimburses special ed on a dollar-for-dollar basis, essentially, but there's a 2-year lag before we get those funds. So in the meantime, the locals have to provide it. And one of the interesting things, if we were to cut positions here, The one we really can't cut is special ed. Because legally, we're going to have to provide those services, whether we do it in-house or outside. Additional ELL teacher, alternative education and student support, so that includes social workers. And one of the things we've been working on, we're going to talk a little bit more in a second, is our graduation rates. And by having more alternatives for students, we're having a positive impact on that. Do you have a question now? No, okay, good. And then in technology and facilities, 5 positions. We are now 1-to-1 with computing from 6th grade on up, and that's a big improvement in the last few years. We also have issues with security. I mean, all you need to do is read about what's happening in the internet and security breaches. So we need further enhancements, and that's what those positions predominantly mean. So I talked about the graduation rate, and let me just talk a little more about that on this slide. Technically, they now use the term completion rates. And students that complete high school in 4 years, 5 years, or 6 years. So the green is the percentage of students that complete Lewiston High School, in this case, in 4 years or less. And you can see that it's been plus or minus, but consistently in that 70% range. And last year, we jumped up to 75%. 1 year does not a trend make. And we'll know a lot more when we compute the graduation rate for this June. I'd like to think that the improvement is significantly impacted by some of the changes and improvements we've made in education in Lewiston. We'll see if that trend is there. You'll notice that 2017 doesn't have a 5 or a 6 year because we need to go another year for the 5 year and a second year for the 6 year. You can see 2016, we added another couple percentage points to that graduation rate. 2015, you can see that we had a few people complete their degree after 6 years too. This does not include people that go into adult ed. That's just the definition of the law. It does not include people that take what's called the HiSET exam, which replaced the old GED. I think graduation rates are one of the most significant data points for Lewiston, and people look at that in evaluating schools and communities. It also has a financial impact on us in that a freshman who drops out of school, we're losing as much as 4 years of state money, $32,000, which is enough to support, almost support a new teaching position in schools. And 100 potential dropouts, and right now, we have classes that have had dropouts as much as 100 people. That could conceivably represent $800,000 in lost state subsidy. So in reviewing our budget, what are some of the things that will be helpful? And some of the stuff was in the flyer that went out to households in Lewiston. We spend less per student than most other districts, except for our special ed costs. They are higher, again, because Lewiston is a service center. We do get reimbursed for them, but there's a 2-year lag. Our budget is at the minimum required local share, which I went through earlier. And another thing, I'm going to show you this more in a second. There's a lot of interest among many people to make sure that the money we do spend is in the classroom rather than in administration. And we spend a higher percentage on student instruction than most other districts in Maine. And it's also helpful to know that 85% of our budget covers personnel costs. And a significant percentage of our employees do live in the city of Lewiston and the surrounding communities. So again, the image of Lewiston is directly tied to a graduation rate, which has started to improve, and I do hope and expect that it represents a trend. So here's the percentage of budgets. This is a new statistic that the state just started computing. You can see this is based on the last completed year, 16-17. And using the definition, and these numbers actually were provided by the Department of Education, you can see Lewiston is number 3 in the whole state of Maine. 71.57% of our budget relates directly to instruction. And we've just included some of the other districts of larger districts in Maine and area districts. And you can see the state average is down here at 63.58%. So I've covered a lot, and I don't know how much I've confused you more, but again, we want to leave with every question answered. So shoot away. And I'm going to hold the microphone just for the recorder, okay?
I had a question. It appears that Lewiston's a magnet for people with special needs.
I think that's a fair statement.
What's the reason for that?
So Lewiston is what is formally called a service center. And by that is, where would you go for a doctor, for a hospital, for mental health services, for that therapist? If you live in, and I'm just picking one town, Buckfield, you're probably coming to Lewiston for those services. So it's already a service center. And if you've got a child with special ed needs and you live in an outer community, you may be concerned about the programming that is available for your child. And we are getting families that are moving to Lewiston because of the special ed programs that we have and the services that are offered in the community.
What's in place that tells everyone that all these services are available to them here in Lewiston versus Portland, Bangor, Brunswick? What brings them up? Is there a mechanism in place? Are there ads being placed in different places to draw people here? It just seems that we're getting a huge percentage of what's coming. Doesn't appear to be any.
Right. So we certainly have no ad program. But that's fine. But I think what we're experiencing in Lewiston is not unlike what's happening in Portland and Bangor as well. And I think if I don't have them right in front of me, but if one were to look at school enrollment, where are they dropping the most? It's in our rural communities. Now there are other factors. Could be employment. Some of those employment opportunities that existed 10, 20, 30 years ago, I'm no economist, but when I think of like paper mills, for example, in places like a Rumford or Lincoln or East Millinocket, they don't exist anymore. So I think it's not only the service centers, but also where is employment.
Yeah, I was looking at the graph, and every other place was just dropping in student numbers, and Lewiston was just continuously climbing. So when you showed us that a great percentage is special ed or special needs children, but you're going to be reimbursed 2 years from now when you get reimbursed, what do you do with the money? Do you put it in a general fund, or does it go back to the people who gave the money in the form of taxes?
Mm-hmm. So when that money is finally received, it's going to use to sustain the programs that started the 2 years prior. And if our enrollment finally caps, and there is a finite supply of housing in Lewiston, and if the special ed percentages are to become more stable, then the rate of growth would significantly slow down and only be impacted by general inflationary factors. I think that, one of the challenges, and I'm glad that we haven't had to deal with this in Lewiston, is communities that have shrinking school budgets are dealing with buildings that are too large, that still need to be heated. They're dealing with teachers that have to be laid off, staff that have to be laid off. And in some cases, they're dealing with school closures that could represent the very heart of a community. Fortunately, we're not in that situation in Lewiston. We do have growing pains, but I think we've got committed and well-educated and effective staff, and we've got, particularly with the new school being built, we've got a physical plant that I think we can be proud of.
Just one last question. I'm just curious about, do you get warning that so many new people are coming? Is there a mechanism, again, in place where you have an idea what's coming at you?
Unfortunately, there is not a good mechanism for that. It would not be uncommon for someone to show up at our doors and they come with already an IEP, a special ed, individualized educational plan. And we have to call the sending school, whether it's in-state or out-of-state, get more information so that we can begin to provide that programming. So, for example, some students require a one-on-one. By that we mean there's got to be a staff member with them all times. If a student moves into Lewiston with that requirement, we legally have to provide it. And that's one of the challenges when we don't have that clairvoyance to know what's going to be forthcoming. Other questions? Miss, do you have any questions? Oh, well, thank you. Yes. Oh, yes, right. So there are two questions on the ballot on Tuesday. One is along the lines of, do you approve the school committee budget as approved by the city council? That's the first question. Then there's a second question that is advisory, and it says to the effect, I think the school budget is too high, just right, or too low. And I think that information is helpful to the school committee as they assess future budgetary needs in Lewiston. So those are the two questions on the ballot. Again, I'm off the top of my head, I would say that it was probably along the lines of 40% thought it was too high, 35% thought it was just right, and 25% thought it was too low. It was something like that. It may have even been a little more on the too high front. Because I think, one of the things you recognize, Lewiston has a large elderly population that often are on fixed incomes. And so where do you find that balance between offering what needs to happen educationally, but being mindful of a community's capacity to pay? The state funding model was the state's attempt to quantify that by developing this terminology, minimum required local share. But because of the changes in the formula this year, that's created quite a jump for Lewiston. And I think that's going to be, the challenge for voters. If the budget is approved, we take seriously our the trust that the public puts in us to educate the children and recognize the responsibilities that we have. If the budget is turned down, we will, and our school committee will look at what adjustments might be appropriate, and we will have to, in that case, present it to the city council again and to voters again. That did happen a couple years ago. Yeah. Yeah.
Two other struggles I think Lewiston faces is 30% of our actual property is not taxable.
Yeah.
So you have those two factors with a high elder population, any increases.
Right. So yes. So 30% of our property non-taxed, and that's got to be among the highest in the state of Maine, I would think. And we already know that Lewiston is one of the poorest communities overall. Not that we don't have some wonderful things happening in this community. Lewiston, on both a dollar amount and a percentage amount, I believe receives the highest state support for education, funding 75% of our budget. Other questions? Sir, do you have any questions? You're good. Well, I thank you all very much, and we're going to get this video posted tomorrow, and hopefully this will be educational to other viewers. Thank you very much for coming.